Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
The job that we had was to stop the Soviet Union from invading Central Europe through the Fulda Gap mostly. But as part of that, we had the nuclear mission.
Step inside the wire of one of NATO's most elite tactical fighter squadrons during the tense final years of the Cold War and into Operation Desert Storm. Former US Air Force officer Michael Makatura's new book, The Fightin Tenth, takes you inside the hardened aircraft shelters of Hahn Air Base and witness life on the front lines of the Cold War. From the heart of West Germany to the skies above Iraq, this gripping episode captures what it means to stand ready for war at a moment's notice, fly the iconic F-16 Viper, and live among warriors with a shared sense of purpose and brotherhood. Makatura's story is filled with grit, fighter pilot mockery, and raw honesty. The Fightin Tenth brings to life the unique culture, mission, and mindset of an American fighter squadron in an unforgettable era. I'm delighted to welcome Michael Makatura to our Cold War conversation.
The book is not a biography, it's a memoir. The book is not about me, it's about us.
I do a lot of interviews with pilots, but I think sometimes people forget that they wouldn't get off the ground without this huge team behind it. I think your book really helps to outline the massive effort that it takes to get these aircraft into the air.
Thank you. Yeah, aircraft do not launch themselves.
Absolutely not, as we will discover in the course of this conversation. I wanted to start with your story. Can you just tell me when and where you were born and who was in your family and your upbringing?
You bet. I was born in a small suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. For those who are less conversant in the geography of the United States, it's up in the north a bit, very much Birmingham in the UK. It's a blue-collar steel-making town, city with really strong ethnic roots. So a lot of Europeans and Eastern European families settled in Pittsburgh and participated in the steel industry. And I was just a normal kid in a normal suburb. And really the first kid in my family to go to college. And as much as I enjoyed growing up and really value growing up with the core values that Pittsburgh brought to the table, I was very much looking forward to seeing the rest of the world. And kind of knew education would be my way to do that. And one thing led to another. And all of a sudden, I'm a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force.
And why did you think the Air Force was a good career path for you?
I think that the goals were really more altruistic, or as I describe them here to Americans, they were red, white, and blue goals. I think that we live in the greatest country in the world, birthed by the country that you live in, and sharing a lot of those same values. And I think part of that is the necessity to preserve those values and to give back. And so that's really why I went into the military, was that I thought that I was suited for military life, and it was a way for me to give back. Once I got there, I also discovered that I really liked the work and the mission, and it just resonated with me and made sense. So it was a great part of my life.
Was there any military history in the rest of your family?
No, there wasn't. I'm the first.
Okay. And so you're enlisted as a second lieutenant, but there's a conversation about your fitness levels, I think, at the recruitment.
That is true. Yeah, I'm a big guy. I come from a family of big guys, and I was an American football player here in the schools. And when I graduated from college, I weighed in at 223, and the recruiter said I needed to be at, I think it was 212. And I got myself in a position where I was at 211 and showed up at officer training school. And they very quickly told me that I was misinformed and I needed to be a pound lighter. And since I wasn't, I was going home. And so that was a pretty interesting day one in the Air Force.
Yeah, but you managed to convince them in the end.
I think there's some providence in there because I don't think little old me can move the United States Air Force to change their mind on anything. But I was determined to be an Air Force officer, and they took me to the squadron commander's office, who said, "Yeah, we're putting you back on an airplane and sending you home." And I said, it was Colonel Lee Nelly, and I said, "No, sir, I'm not leaving. I'm here to be an Air Force officer, and I'm just not leaving voluntarily." And he stared at me really hard, and I don't know what he saw or heard in my countenance that convinced him, but he said, "Okay, then in that case, we're just going to wear you out while you're here, and we'll see if you really want to stay." And just as quickly as I was out, I was back in.
And aside from that physical training, what is the Air Force officer training like in the US Air Force? So this is late 80s, 1987,
That's right.
I think you went in.
Yeah, that's exactly right. All of us have seen movies of the typical drill instructor shouting and screaming at enlisted troops and putting them through the ringer. Officer training school is slightly different. The basic military training is breaking people down really physically, right? Putting them under intense physical pressure and breaking down civilians and then building them back up as troops. Officer training school was more of a mental endeavor than it was a physical endeavor, although there were physical elements to it. But officer training school was all about breaking down the self-centric civilian into something that could be built back up as a mission-centric officer. And so there were plenty of head games that got played, and none of them were malicious. They were all very well intentioned. And I tell a story in the book of the very first day in officer training school where my flight commander, who is affectionately known as the big dog, walked into the room, and we were standing at attention and we were going to undergo our first inspection. And the big dog put his nose about 3 inches from my nose and said, "Your shoes aren't shined correctly. That's a demerit." And I thought, how would he know? He hasn't even looked at my shoes. And then he got down on the floor and looked at my shoes and said, "You have got an improper shave. That's another demerit." And I thought, what's going on here? The corollary to that story was I actually failed that inspection 4 days in a row. So I went home, and the next morning I shaved really carefully, and I still got dinged for improper shave. And I asked him, and he said, "You have a really heavy beard, so you need to shave in all four directions." And so I shaved in all four directions and came back the next day, and he gigged me for improper shave. And I said, "What now?" And he said, "Maybe you should use some Vaseline, some petroleum jelly before you shave." And I tried that and came back, and he gave me another demerit for improper shave. And this time he said, "You have 3 hairs that are sticking out of your t-shirt." And I looked at him because I'm not the brightest bulb, but I eventually get things. And I said to him, "Are you telling me that I need to shave my chest to make it through officer training school?" And he gave me a wry grin and said, "That's right." And what he was really doing over the course of those 4 days was saying to me, "How badly do you want this? Will you die to self and conform yourself to what the military requires of you?" That. And the answer to that question was, "Yes, I will." And that was the first of many lessons that were all about tearing down the civilian and building up the military officer.
And at that point, did you know what role you were going to go into within the Air Force?
I did. When I initially signed the contract, I wanted to be an intelligence officer and subsequently would be in my later career. But that career field was not available at the time. And so I signed up to become an operations management officer, which is essentially doing all of those functions, those back office functions necessary to make a flying squadron work. And so I knew that after officer training school, I would be going in that direction.
So when you finish the officer training school, how long does it take to train you for that specific role?
It was about 3 months. And by then I had already received my assignment. So I knew where I was going, and it was just a matter of getting a primer on operations management before I got there.
Your first posting is to West Germany. Had you been to Europe before that point?
I had not been. And for at the time, probably a 23-year-old young man, I was actually pretty well traveled inside of the US, but I had never been to Europe. So when I received that assignment, it was the first of many. Wow, you've got to be kidding me. That's really interesting.
The actual posting is at Hahn Air Force Base. Can you remember that first day that you arrive in Germany and how different it feels and
Absolutely.
that first day feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the interesting things about this memoir, Ian, is it was such an incredible experience to a young man freshly out of school that most of this is saved up in my brain almost like a movie strip. And so I can literally recall where I was and what I was wearing and who said what. Yes, when I showed up at Frankfurt Airport, what was immediately apparent was I wasn't in Pittsburgh anymore. Everything was different, from the language to the vendors to everything. And one of the things that I distinctly remember is getting in the transportation to go from Frankfurt Airport, International Airport, out to Hahn, and the road signs were blue. In America, they're green. And it never dawned on me that it would be anything other than what I was used to. And so, again, it was an immediate lesson that the way that I lived and grew up is not exactly the way that everybody does around the world. When I finally got to Hahn, my sponsor there was another lieutenant, although I was a second lieutenant or lieutenant, and he was a first lieutenant. He was one rank above me. His name was J.D. Williams. And as I got to the operations building, just like I had been trained in officer training school, I approached, at the time, Lieutenant Williams, gave him my crisp salute, and said, "Sir," Lieutenant Makatura reporting as ordered, "Sir." And J.D. Williams looked at me with a grin on his face and said, "Be careful with that. You're going to put an eye out." And I was taken aback because I had come from a very regimented training environment, and now I was in the real Air Force, if you will, and I didn't expect that. And that was an eye opener, and it was an introduction to the real Air Force. And then shortly thereafter, as the day progressed, JD took me to a German Gasthaus that was right off the front gate to Hahn, and that was also culture shock. As I walked into this room, I saw a bed that looked different than the beds that I was used to in the United States. It had a duvet folded on top of it, and I didn't know what a duvet was. And I had no idea if that was part of the mattress and I should sleep on top of it, or if it was a blanket and I should sleep under it. So I split the baby and I unfolded it and slept between the folds. And then when I walked into the bathroom of this Gasthaus, there was this funny round plastic thing on the wall with two holes in it. And I swear to you, Ian, it sounds so silly now. Of course, you should have figured out what that was. It took me 15 minutes to figure out that was an electrical outlet. And lo and behold, this operates on 110 and Germany's on 220, and they have different outlets. And so that whole first day was a culture shock, not only the culture of the community that I would be living in, but a different culture from the very regimented Air Force that I had just graduated from.
Right. What does JD get you started with as a newly minted second lieutenant?
JD's role was really to help me get acclimated to squadron life after duty and to life on the German economy. Because the reality is, JD was an F-16 pilot, and he was pretty darn busy, right? And so there wasn't a whole lot of guidance from him on my day-to-day kind of operational duties and tasks. A lot of that just came from personal initiative, understanding what my role was. And as I mentioned earlier, an F-16 squadron has 40 pilots in it, and those guys are very busy on very serious business. There are a whole lot of other things that have to happen that enable those guys to do their jobs, and that was my job, right? And so I took that very seriously, that my responsibility was to make sure that the squadron worked efficiently so that the mission could be met.
So at this point, are you the executive officer?
Yes.
Then for the squadron?
Correct.
And so that role is like the administrative backbone.
That's right.
Of the squadron to ensure the pilots focus on their primary role. I was really surprised because you had a load of other administrative duties as well, like hardened shelter manager and security program custodian,
Right.
nuclear surety compliance officer. It sounds like there's a lot of plates you're spinning there.
Yeah, there really were. And some of them were much more interesting, like the ones that you mentioned, than others. As part of the squadron operations, we had two operations buildings. One was what we called soft ops, and that's where the admin side of things happened. The other was hard ops, and that's where the business side of an F 16 squadron occurred. That hardened operations building was blast proof. It had an air filtration system. So the anticipation was when World War III occurred, there was going to be nuclear, biological, or chemical attacks, and we needed a building that would preserve the safety of the squadron and allow us to continue to operate. And I had to manage the physical plant of that hardened aircraft shelter. When it came to nuclear surety, we had a nuclear mission at Hahn, and as you might expect, there are quite stringent regulations for handling nuclear material, handling everything that went with the nuclear program, and keeping everybody personally reliable in mental and physical condition to meet and handle a nuclear mission. And so somebody's got to administer that. That was me.
What was daily life like, or the culture like, for the F-16 pilots at Hahn?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a big part of what I try to convey in the book. What I'll start with is the men and women of the Fightin Tenth were just ordinary Americans who had signed up to do a job. But I never want to lose sight of the fact that these weren't superhumans. They were just normal American men and women, and in some case, almost boys and girls. However, the culture in a fighter squadron is deadly serious, marked with a whole lot of stress relieving frivolity and boyhood pranks, if you will. The reason that it's deadly serious is pretty easy to ascertain, right? The job that we had was to stop the Soviet Union from invading Central Europe through the Fulda Gap mostly, but in every way that they could have. That's pretty serious business. As part of that, we had the nuclear mission, and we're part of the overall nuclear deterrent towards the Soviet Union. That's pretty serious stuff. And then just the business of flying F 16s, high performance jet fighters, it's inherently dangerous, Ian. And every day when you leave the house, and if you're an F-16 pilot and you're going to work, there's a distinct possibility that you're not coming home. The F-16 even heightened that a little bit because it's a single seat, single engine fighter. So for folks who are familiar with the Top Gun movies, you two people in that cockpit, and those planes have two engines. The F-16 did not have those luxuries. It was a single seat, single engine fighter. So the guy flying the plane, not only is he the pilot, but he's the navigator, he's the weapon systems officer, he's the communications officer, he's everything. And it's a very complex weapon system that one man has to master. The fact that he's sitting on a rocket engine and only one of them makes it even more exciting, because if that engine goes out, then he became a very heavy lawn dart. And so, again, in flying an F 16, or really any fighter aircraft, but especially the F 16, is an inherently dangerous line of work. And what that results in, both the mission, the responsibility that we shouldered, and flying that jet fighter, it requires excellence. Excellence as a minimum. And of course, we're human beings, so excellence takes some time to attain. And what that means is that the culture of radical candor was omnipresent. There was no time or margin of error to beat around the bush. We talked very plainly with each other in very direct terms. And so that was part of the culture. And it was one of the interesting things, one of the interesting lifelong lessons that it inculcated in me. Before I got there, I guess I had the mindset of good enough was good enough. And I was a good student through school, but I was not an excellent student. And part of what the Fightin Tenth taught me is that we really have a responsibility to God, to the people around us, and to ourselves to maximize the talents that we've been blessed with. And that was certainly the situation there. The flip side of that culture, as you might expect, it builds a lot of pressure and stress on a human's shoulders. And every pressure cooker needs an outlet. And so the outlet and the Fightin Tenth, and dare I say all fighter squadrons, is a sort of ribald, Monty Python-esque humor that comes out as we tease each other and pick on each other and call each other out for our foibles, and do so usually with a mug of beer in our hands. And so that was also a big part of fighter pilot culture, is this: we worked hard and we played hard. And a lot of that playing hard was the ability to release a lot of that stress and pressure, and also to bond with our brothers in arms.
Yeah, I think you describe it in the book that the culture demanded a thick skin, sharp wits, and absolute focus. And one of the things I found particularly fun was the naming ceremonies,
Yeah.
which is where pilots end up with their call sign.
Yeah.
If you could just take me again through how that works.
Let me relate to you two anecdotes, because I think both of them carry lessons with them. So by the time a new lieutenant or lieutenant showed up at Hahn, they were quite full of themselves, and with good reason. Only 1 to 2% of the applicants actually make it through undergraduate pilot training and make it into the cockpit of a fighter jet. 1 to 2%. And then to get assigned to Hahn, even if you got a fighter, to get assigned to Hahn was really the cream of the crop, because you were going to an operational F-16 unit at the closest air base to Moscow. And so when young lieutenants showed up at the squadron, they were good, and they knew they were good. And they had just spent a good bit of their training time with people telling them that they were good and validating that idea. And so one of the challenges that you have when you show up in an F-16 squadron is you cannot have false bravado. You cannot be overconfident, because overconfidence was going to kill somebody. And all of the veteran pilots knew it. And so, very much like I got broken down early in officer training school, that had to happen at the Fightin Tenth. That had to happen in the squadron. What would happen is the young lieutenant would show up full of himself, and the old veterans would start to crack that bravado shell in order to make sure that everybody was safe and operating as a cohesive unit. And I don't even know how it happened, Ian. It's almost like divine intervention. It would just happen. It was never planned, but this young lieutenant would be at the duty desk. Maybe he was getting ready to study, or exactly what happened. And he would be approached by one of the veteran pilots, and a conversation would ensue that sounded very much, "Hey, welcome to Hahn. Where did you go to pilot training?" And the young guy would say, "Oh, I went to Willie." "Oh, that's terrific. I went to Willie too. And geez, you must have done really well to get an F-16." And be like, "Oh, yeah, I was top of the class." "Oh, really? Did you have a call sign?" And inevitably, the young lieutenant would come out with something manly. They used to call me Thor, or Maverick, or Ace, something really, really machismo. We knew this was going to happen. And by the way, as this conversation between two people is occurring, there's like a gravitational pull. And other veteran pilots from around the squadron would just start to come towards this conversation. So by the end of the conversation, there's 10 guys standing around with this new lieutenant. And so the grizzled veteran would say, "Oh, they called you Thor, huh? That's a pretty good call sign. But I think we're going to call you Bambi." And of course, what ensued was raucous laughter and slapping on the shoulders, and everybody would say, "Hey, Bambi, welcome to the squad." And meanwhile, the young guy standing there, what the hell just happened? Like, I told him that my call sign was Thor, and now they're going to name me after a baby deer. What's happening? And so that, again, was part of this this kind of ritual breaking down the cocksure young lieutenant and helping him understand that he had a place in this ecosystem and wasn't at the top. And so we're gonna make sure that you're safe and that you know how to fly. So that's one part of the call sign. And sometimes I get asked the question, so did you guys call him Bambi for 2 weeks? We sure did, as a matter of fact. We even got him a name tag that said Bambi. Now, most of that didn't stick. And so at some point, he would be given a long-term call sign. And when I say long-term, 35 years later, those call signs still stick with guys, right? And the way that normally happened, there were usually two ways that you got a call sign. Sometimes it was your name. So my last name is Makatura. It was shortened to Mac, and that's stuck, right? The commander of the 10th, Ed Hool, became Julio. So a kind of an off take from his last name. So last names happened, but more often than not, it was stupid things that you did that the guys didn't want you to forget. And one of the flight commanders when I got to Hahn was Craig Wilkerson, and his nickname, his call sign is Skip. And he got that call sign because he was on a bombing range. And on a bombing range, there are skip pits and strafe pits. Skip pits are made of concrete and allow you to bounce a bomb, skip a bomb off the concrete into the side of a building. Strafe pits are made of sand and allow you to use the guns on your airplane, and the sand absorbs the bullets. Well, if you get those two things confused and you shoot your bullets onto the concrete skip pit, they become deadly projectiles where they're not when they're not supposed to be. And of course, he did that. Hence, his nickname was Skip. And usually that occurred over some formal naming ceremony that involved alcohol and laughter.
Brilliant. Brilliant. A while back, this was quite a while back, I interviewed a Canadian F-104 pilot, and he had accidentally crossed over into East Germany very briefly, crossed the border. His last name was Horn, and he became Hornsky.
Yes, exactly.
I think the other thing that I found really interesting is the language, the shorthand language that the pilots use in the air. Has a lot of it is originated from the Royal Air Force.
That's
so
right.
Angels, and I don't know, do you use tally-ho?
Yes, tally-ho, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And it just sounds like something out of the Battle of Britain. I was surprised you didn't have your own language.
There's, in the fighter pilot community, there is a strong tie to those who came before us and showed us the way. And there were a lot of things that tied back to the RAF. And that's certainly one of them. The thing that's really interesting is those terms make their way into your vernacular and you start using them in a civilian setting. And even now, all this many years later, if my wife and I are driving and I see what we're looking for, I'll say tally-ho, and she'll look at me like, you can stop doing that now. But yes.
Yeah. And when your gas tank's getting low, you go, oh, we're on bingo fuel.
Bingo fuel. Yeah,
Brilliant.
Some of that still happens. Old habits die hard.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Love it. Love it. You did mention a while back life on the economy. So life on the economy is living outside the base. So you're living amongst West German civilians. That was one thing that you chose to do, was to live on the economy.
Yeah, most of us did. It was a fabulous experience. It was a growing experience. I always believe, Ian, that context is important to telling any story. And so the context here in the mid to late 80s, it was only 40 some years after World War II, which means that the German children and young adults during World War II were still active in society in this time frame that I'm writing about, right? And certainly the fact that the Axis powers lost and the Allied powers prevailed was still fresh in everybody's mind. In addition, Germany, following the war, essentially became an occupied country. There were so many U.S. bases and servicemen, a sprinkling of British. Even in 1988, they were an occupied country. And going to live out amongst them in quote unquote on the economy against that backdrop. So that said, it was a fabulous experience. Rented the top floor of a German home, The home was absolutely beautiful, completely different than how I was raised and what I was used to in the United States, and different in so many wonderful ways. And then just living in a small German village next to German farmers and their families was just a wonderfully immersive experience. And what I would tell you is the German people are formal people. Two Germans can live next door to each other for 30 years and not refer to themselves or each other by their first names. It's Herr Müller and Herr Wagner. And so, even more so, this young American who's probably driving too fast through the village. So, there's an element of those two cultures meeting. They didn't clash, but they met. And really, it was incumbent on us to embrace the culture in which we were living. And we did. And it was a wonderful experience for all of us, but especially for a young man, be able to live a little bit of the German lifestyle in these tiny villages.
You're near the Moselle Valley, aren't you? So the lovely vineyards as well.
Fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. And I can tell you, we certainly took advantage of that. We fell in love with the traditions around German winemaking. But I will tell you, I can remember they would have wine fests, and we would go to enjoy those wine fests. And there were many Americans who overserved themselves during those wine fests and behaved boorishly. And I can remember thinking to myself, it's too bad that happens, because these are proud people who are living out traditions they've had for hundreds of years, and in a way we're soiling them with some bad behavior. But truthfully, that happened and it occurred, and we watched it. There was much more appreciation for being able to participate arm in arm with our German neighbors.
And how good did your German get, Michael?
Not very. I try hard not to live life in regrets, but it is something as I look back that I wish I had immersed myself in the language more. I have enough to order a beer, find the train station, and potentially bail myself out if needed.
My German's not great. Zwei Bier bitte. What else do you need to know?
Yeah.
That's a typical British answer, that. I want to talk about the sort of social structure of the squadron. So in the book, you describe the flight, which is the close-knit cell of 4 to 8 pilots who trained and partied together. You've got the Lieutenants Protection Association. And then almost the glue that holds the thing is the family life as well, in terms of, and you describe the wives of the steady force.
Yeah. Wow. What a tremendous group of people. So, again, some context is in order. The husbands signed up to be Air Force officers and signed up to be pilots. Um, the wives didn't. They got brought along as part of the package, right? And they're enormously courageous and strong women to be able to live that life. And I referenced earlier that every day that a pilot goes to work, there's a chance that they're not coming home. The wives are aware of that too, right? Every day that my husband or dad leaves the house, I'm not sure that he's going to make it home. That in and of itself is a tremendous burden to bear. And then you add to that some of the frivolity that occurs to release pressure, as we were talking earlier. And so the wives have to put up with that tomfoolery. My wife says I'm the same as a 12-year-old. I just have deadly toys now. And she's right. And so those wives had to deal with that part of the culture. And then just the nature of military service, there are demands placed on military members, whether those demands are over the course of a week or a surprise deployment or even a scheduled deployment where you go away for 30 days to better flying weather to keep yourself current. And then mom becomes everything in the household. She bears all of the responsibility for making the household work and for tending to the children. And then after 30 days, the husband comes back and it takes its toll on the wives and the families. These are very impressive, talented, strong women who also go through their own gauntlet and become accentuated in all of those characteristics that they already hold. And they really were the glue that held it all together while all of us knuckleheads were off doing what we do. They were the fabric that kept it all together. And all of us who have had the honor to kind of walk this path recognize how special these ladies are.
You mentioned a while back as well about the nuclear missions at Hahn, and the pilots themselves had to maintain an annual nuke certificate. Can you just explain what they had to do in order to retain that?
Yeah, I think that it came down to two things. The biggest is incredibly strict, detailed standards around their missions. And I want to be careful. I know it's 5 years down the road, but I do want to just be careful from a classified standpoint that my discussion doesn't reveal too much. But so we called them lines. There were lines in the overall NATO plan. And we at the 10th were the custodians of a number of those lines or missions. And an incredible amount of study went into the intricate details of those taskings, those missions. And just to give you an idea, each of those missions had a time over target, or TOT, and that was the moment that you would be dropping or releasing your weapon. When we planned for those missions, the tolerance for pass or fail was plus or minus 1 second. Think about that for a moment. You're flying a very complex machine through a war zone with enemies interdicting you and weapons coming up and trying to thwart your mission. And through all of that, your pass-fail criteria is plus or minus 1 second. And the reason for that precision is if you're dropping a nuclear weapon and you're dropping it 30 seconds late, the ripple effects from that could be disastrous for not only the mission, but for other airmen and other ground troops, et cetera, right? And so the whole plan required an immense amount of precision and therefore an immense amount of discipline and study and a very rigorous expectation of how you were going to tackle that mission. So that was part of it. Another part of it, frankly, was mental temperament and mental steadiness. We're human beings, right? And things happen in our lives. Family members get sick and pass away, and marriage is a difficult institution to be part of, and kids are demanding on us. And so there was a mental stability and an even temperance that was required to know that if, in fact, because you never knew when we might be deploying this plan, it could be tomorrow. And so you needed to be well to be able to carry that responsibility. And that was part of the program as well.
Because these guys, they're flying low level in Northern Europe, where the weather is often not as good as it can be.
Correct.
So even without enemy fire or anything like that,
that's right.
You've got quite a lot of challenges there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I'll give you one little anecdote that amplifies your point. J.D. Williams, my sponsor who we talked about earlier, came back from a mission one day and he just looked horrible. He just didn't look like himself. And I said, hey, what's going on? And he said, well, come with me. And we went back into the mission planning room and he took out his map and he showed me where one of his steer points was located. And he had actually drawn a circle around that steer point, and the black marker of that circle occluded a communications tower. And so as he was flying that mission, as he was turning around there, he didn't expect the big tower to be right in front of him, and it was. And so he quickly jinked out of that and wasn't sure he was going to survive it. He did, obviously, but by the time he got back to the squadron, he was quite shaken. And so, yeah, flying low level in the fog and rain of Central Europe was not for the faint-hearted.
No. Did you ever go up in any of the aircraft to get a feel as to what it was like?
Thank God I did, yes. Yeah, it's fabulous. Would you like me to describe some of that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was fabulous, Ian. And flying, I mentioned earlier, the F-16 is a single-seat fighter. There are models called D models that had a second seat behind them, and they were there for training purposes. And important in the F-16 is that the back seat is a full replica of the front seat. So you can actually fly the jet from the back seat. It is a full functioning cockpit back there as well. And so one of the amazing things about the F-16 is you sit above and in front of the majority of the plane. So the engine is below you and behind you, and the fuselage is obviously behind you. And there was a big bubble canopy in the F-16. Previous to the F-16, canopies were more shrouded in metal. And in this case, you're sitting up in this big bubble canopy and you've got this incredible visibility. You're reclined in the seat by 30 degrees. And so it's quite comfortable, even though it's not spacious. It's quite comfortable and it's quite serene. And in fact, in the book, there's a section called Serene Lethality. So you're flying in this very lethal instrument of war, but it's actually quite quiet and quite serene in the cockpit. The other thing that made the F-16 kind of a dream is it's the first aircraft that did not have mechanical controls. So previous to the F-16, when you moved the yoke of an aircraft, there was linkage tied to your ailerons or your stabilizers. And it was that linkage that when you moved the yoke, the linkage moved those flight controls. In an F-16, that's not the case. It's all computerized, and we referred to it as fly-by-wire. And so there were no mechanical controls. As such, so in the F-16, the throttle is on your left, and that does in fact move. But the stick, there's no yoke in the center, there's a stick on your right hand. And that stick actually doesn't move very much. In fact, an interesting little aside is when they first fielded the F-16, the stick didn't move at all. And so all of your inputs were based on pressure. That was very disconcerting to veteran pilots who were used to moving a yoke back and forth, left and right. And so they actually had to build some play into the stick so that guys had a kind of a tactile response to moving their hand. That said, even today, it doesn't move very much. It doesn't move an inch, right? So it moves just a little bit. But combined with seating at a 30-degree angle above and in front of the loud engine with a bubble canopy, with these controls that are hands-on throttle and stick controls with a HUD in front of you, and it was a dream. It was like flying a two-seat convertible sports car. And the jet is incredibly responsive to what you want it to do. And the F-16 is actually pretty small. And so that small size also makes it highly maneuverable. The thrust to weight ratio of the engine to this small airplane makes it highly maneuverable. Man, it was a ton of fun to fly that jet. And it was incredibly exciting. At the same time, very physiologically taxing. The fighter pilots have to be in really good physical shape to withstand the forces of G that get placed on their bodies. Of course, you're wearing a G suit, which is an inflatable ladder that starts at your diaphragm and then goes down to your ankles. And it has an umbilical that you plug into the jet. And so that it's all kind of automatic. Based on the G's that the jet is pulling, it speaks to that G suit and it inflates and deflates based on the conditions you're in. What that does, though, is it constricts all of the major muscle groups in the lower half of your body with the idea that you want to keep all the blood in your brain. Because when the blood has gravity pulling it down towards your feet, if it leaves your brain, you go nighty-night. And so you've got on this G suit and the jet is doing that to you, but you also have to essentially bear down, very much like a woman giving birth, although I won't share that example with my wife, I don't think, because I think I'd probably have some backlash there. But very much you have to bear down. So you're breathing and you're constricting your chest muscles and you're pushing out air, as you will, all of which is designed to keep the blood up in your brain. After doing that for a couple of hours, you're pretty tired, right? You've exercised all the major muscle groups in your body and it can be really draining. But it was an absolute joy to be able to sit in the back seat with some of these guys and fly with them.
Yeah, because in the book you describe a situation with the G's where you don't successfully keep the blood in your brain.
That is true. In fact, I'm golfing with that gentleman next week. We were down in the Gulf of Spain for a weapons training deployment, and I went up in the back seat of Doug Frenchie French. And after we flew our mission, Frenchie said, "Hey, do you want to pull 9Gs?" And I'm like, "Absolutely." And so he said, "All right, you see that lake down off of our left? We're gonna pull down off over that lake." And I said, "All right, great." So as the F-16 has two multifunction displays that basically sit above each of your knees, so one's slightly to the left and one's slightly to the right. Those multifunction displays, as their title suggests, can display a lot of different information. In this case, the G meter was on the right MFD, and we're about to pull left. And so I'm in position. The G suit starts to inflate. I'm bearing down and doing my breathing, and I'm looking down over the left out of the cockpit. But I'm still trying with my peripheral vision to see how many G's we're pulling, which is on the right. And I made the mistake of easing up, and I picked my head up and I turned to the right to see the G meter. And I think the last thing I saw was 6.8, and then that was it. And the next thing that occurred was I can hear Frenchie laughing. And he's laughing, and he's saying, "Mac, you okay? Mac, get your feet off the front rudder pedals. Mac, you okay?" And I'm starting to get my wits about me, and I answer, and I'm like, "Yeah, okay." And he's laughing the whole time, and he's like, "So what's going on?" And I said, "I don't know, I can't see." He's, "What do you mean you can't see?" And I said, I can't see anything. All I can see is white." And so he knows instantly what happened, and he's laughing. And he said, "Okay, pull your chin to your chest." And so I do that. I do the bobblehead. And what had happened was I had a G-induced loss of consciousness, or G-lock. And I went to sleep for a moment. And when I did so, the top of my helmet was resting on the back of the seat, and I was looking straight up out of the cockpit at the clouds. And so he helped me reorient my head, and that was good. And again, all of the while, Frenchie's laughing, and he said, "All right, can you take the jet?" And I said, "I can't." And he said, "Why not?" And I said, "I can't move my arms." And he said, "What do you mean you can't move your arms?" And I said, "My arms are up on the rails and I can't move them." And so again, I turned into a rag doll when I lost consciousness, and I literally could not move my arms. And he's like, "All right." So it took about 10 minutes for me to gather myself before I can actually fly the jet again. And then Frenchie said to me, "You don't want to tell anybody that this happened because they'll never let you fly again." And for 35 years, I held that secret. And as I was writing the book, I said to Frenchie, "Hey, can I tell this story?" And he's, "Yeah, you're good."
Wow. Wow. That sounds like a hell of an experience. So you're at Hahn when the Berlin Wall opens. Can you remember hearing the news of that and how you heard it?
Yeah, distinctly. I was actually supposed to be in Berlin that weekend. Guy in the squadron, Jerry Jethro Black, and his lovely wife, Teresa, were going to Berlin to visit. And there was a corridor. There was one Autobahn that provided a corridor from West Germany into West Berlin. And Jethro actually came to me because as the admin part of the squadron, I had to create those orders, which were actually on Russian stationery with Cyrillic letters and all of that stuff. And I had to type in Anglo answers to all of those questions. And so Jerry and Teresa invited me to go with them. And again, no regrets, but boy, I should have said yes, because what ended up happening was that was weekend in the week that the wall came down. And gratefully, Jethro and Teresa actually brought me a piece of the Berlin Wall that I have in my office. So yeah, I remember it very well. The most interesting thing I think about that, Ian, was the reaction of my German landlords. And so we anticipated that this would be a great thing for the German peoples. For 45 years, families had been separated by a wall and a fence. And so shortly after the wall came down, I was speaking with my German landlords, and I said, "Hey, this is great news, isn't it? Do you have family that you're going to be able to reunite with?" And they were very measured. And they said, "Yes, it is great news. And yes, we have a couple of generations of family that we've never physically met. So we're looking forward to doing that." And I said, "You seem a little reticent, though. Tell me more about that." And they said, "We've spent 45 years rebuilding our society. and putting ourselves in the position that we're in today. And those people are going to want all of that tomorrow. And so we're very grateful that they're free. We'd just like them to be free over there. And I thought, wow, that's really vulnerable. Some may say even a little caustic, but it was very real. And there was that aura that was going on at the time in West Germany that we're very glad that this has occurred, but we're also a little wary of what it's going to mean for West German society moving forward.
Were you at any point concerned about what impact that might have on your livelihood? The fact that suddenly we were going to be friends with the East Germans and...
No, not really. I think that the term that we used is peace is breaking out all over, as opposed to war breaking out all over. Peace is breaking out all over. But we knew that there were other missions and other duties around the world for the Air Force, and so we just will be reassigned to one of them. So no, I don't think there was ever any hint of worry about our livelihood.
And you were right about other duties, because within a year, there's Operation Desert Storm, where your squadron is trained to fight and they are in combat. And you're still the XO then. How difficult was it to do that logistics, I don't know, jump through hoops to move from Hahn to the desert?
Again, a little bit of context here. I actually did not deploy with the 10th. And the second half of the book is all about Desert Storm. And I couldn't tell that story from a first-person narrative. And when I began writing the book, I contacted Colonel Julio, who was the commander during Desert Storm, and said, hey, would you like to write this book with me? And he said, I don't want to be a co-author with you, but I'll certainly help you. And 90% of the second half of the book, the Desert Storm part of the book, is a third-person narrative based on Julio's war journal. His name deserves to be on the cover of this book. I think he just doesn't want to be associated with me anymore or something like that. I was in the Hahn command post when the 10th deployed. And so to answer your question, it is a Herculean task to pick up a fighter squadron from where it is, not only just everything from maps to toilet paper, but the 24 jets, all of the maintenance crews. It's a Herculean task to pick up and move, which is why we did it twice a year in peacetime. So we were used to deploying to either Zaragoza Air Base in Spain or Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. And so we had practiced moving the squadron often, but it's still a very big task. In this case, the pilots shuttling 24 F-16s out of Europe, over the Mediterranean, through the length of the Mediterranean, over Egypt and the Middle East, and ultimately landing over there in the UAE. That's a big flight with a lot of coordination, a lot of air refueling has to go on. Told you how fun it was to fly in an F-16, and I likened it to driving a two-seat convertible. Think about driving a two-seat convertible for 12 hours, right? Except you can't stop, right? You can't pull over and use the restroom. And so, yeah, it's a really big task. I think the biggest task, though, Ian, is the mental one. We had spent all of our time flying low level over Central Europe, training to fight the Soviets. All of a sudden, we're going to go fight a war that we didn't train for, because we're not going to fly low level over verdant fields. We're going to fly high level over the sand. And we're not going to be fighting against Russian pilots. We're going to be fighting against Iraqi pilots. That was a huge difference. And I think it's a testament to the skill and talent and training of the air crews that they were able to do that flawlessly. The last thing I'll introduce into the conversation now, on hindsight, we look back at Desert Storm and it was a turkey shoot in hindsight, because going into it, we expected 25% attrition. So of the 40 pilots that we took to the desert, 10 of them weren't coming home. And war gets really personal when the voice on the radio is your friend. And so it's under this mental gymnastics of, we're not going to be flying low level over Germany. We're going to be flying high level over the desert. And by the way, 25% of us are probably not coming home. That's the That's the tenor in which the Fighting Tenth entered Desert Storm.
And did the pilots know about that potential attrition rate or not?
It's really interesting because even now, after writing the book, that's somewhat in question. So, in talking with Julio, he tells me that he did not make that known, but in talking with other guys, they knew it. And things like that tend to filter through even the tightest operational security and get down to the guys who are flying the jets.
Because I guess if the Cold War went hot at the Fulda Gap, there would have been an even worse attrition rate
Absolutely.
than what they were expecting in Desert Storm. Now, you take on this role. Is it an unofficial role of squadron historian?
I think it is an unofficial. It is certainly an unofficial role. Yes.
Okay, and you capture these stories, and the last part of the book has some of these stories, and I love the call signs here. We've got Captain Bill Psycho Andrews, Lieutenant Joey Boohoo Booher, I presume his last name.
Yes.
Lieutenant Colonel Terry Raging Bull. Great call signs, but I think Bill, I can't say these with a straight face. Captain Bill Psycho Andrews is a really interesting one because he describes being shot down over Iraq and taken prisoner. Can you just explain what happens to him?
Yeah, you bet. And starting with the nickname or the call sign, most of us referred to Bill as BA, his two initials, Bill Andrews BA. Somehow he got psycho. I think Bill had a lazy eye that sometimes looked like he was looking cross-eyed, and so I don't know if that's how he got psycho or not. But I talked to Stacy Andrews because Bill passed away from cancer, I think in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, and so I contacted Stacy Andrews, and she gracefully allowed me to use Bill's war journal to talk about the anecdote where he got shot down. And I asked Stacy, I said, so how do you want me to refer to Bill in the book? Is it psycho or is it BA? And she said he preferred BA. And I said, absolutely. So I still, for the most part, refer to him as BA. The situation, Bill was the flight commander. He's an Air Force Academy graduate. He was the flight commander of Mutt Flight. It was Mutt 41, 42, 43, and 44 was his foreship. Joey Boer was his wingman, so he was Mutt 42. Joey subsequently became a two-star general in the Air Force. And then Pete Abner McCaffrey and Evan Thomas, so Abner and Ivan, were numbers 3 and 4. It was towards the end of the war. I think there were about 10 days left in the war. Of course, at the time he was shot down, we didn't know that. But it was towards the end of the war, and the fighting on the ground was still hot and heavy, and BA and Joey dipped below the clouds. It was a active battlefield, and as they were starting to say, okay, we need to get out of Dodge here, we need to get out of harm's way, Bill got hit by a surface-to-air missile, and so he ejects from the airplane, and as he is floating down to the ground, they're shooting at him, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention, but they're shooting small arms fire at him. When he finally gets on the ground, he breaks his leg, and so he can't really move, and they are closing in on him. He's still communicating with his flight mates and telling them what's going on, but they're closing in on him, and what he notices is that the troops around him and the weapon systems around him look like they're still aiming for his flight mates. He gets back on his survival radio and tells them that you're being targeted, break right, probably saving somebody else from getting shot down. Bill then gets captured and treated roughly, and gets taken to Baghdad. While all of that's going on, Mark Hebine, who also has two nicknames, Gandhi the Firewalker and Heebs, and mostly we referred to him as Heebs. Heebs goes down below the clouds to see if he can help rescue Bill. They start shooting at Heebs. Heebs, in the book, I relate this story part of it. He thought he was a goner too. He thought he was going to get hit. Providence said there was a different plan, and so he was able to escape up. But Bill gets captured and taken prisoner. Of course, back at the command center, we don't really know exactly what's going on. We don't know if he's dead or alive. We don't know where he is. We're hoping for the best, but we just don't know. They subsequently sent in a rescue helicopter to try to recover Bill, to rescue him. That helicopter got shot down. 5 American troops lost their lives, and the other 3 were taken prisoners and treated horribly as prisoners of war. And then, so as you might expect, it's really interesting when things like this happen to military units, because there is a somber nature that takes over. Let's face it, one of our own shot down, and we don't know if he's alive or dead. The flip side of that coin is we still have a job to do. And so while it's somber, it is not overly emotional, and it is not in any way crippling. So we're professionals, and we're going to do our jobs, and we're going to hope hope the best for Bill. Eventually, the war was over just a few days, 10 days later, and there was an announcement that the Red Cross was going to bring the POWs out of Iraq, and we were hoping that Bill would be one of those, and lo and behold, he was. And that's the first time 10 days later that we actually knew that Bill was alive. And so he was evacuated on the hospital medical airplane to Landstuhl back in Germany, where they patched up his leg, and then he was taken out to Andrews Air Force Base in the United States for a reunion with his family.
Wow. Were there any fatalities with the squadron?
Not in our squadron. Not in our squadron. So Bill was really the only casualty. We were one of 3 squadrons at Al Dhafra. It was the 363rd Tactical Fighter Wing Provisional. There were 2 squadrons from Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina and Hahn, the 10th from Hahn. One of the pilots from one of the Shaw squadrons was killed in the middle of Desert Storm, but it was a spatial disorientation thing, and his jet crashed on the approach to the field, and he was killed. His name was Dale Cormier.
Right. Because I think it's something that I've mentioned in other episodes, but the number of pilots or military service people who are killed during the Cold War by accidents on exercises or flying, I imagine is quite a large number. I've yet been able to try and find a quantification of what that number is. With the 10th, were there any accidents or fatalities there?
Yeah, there were. There were 5 midair fatalities in my time in the 10th. And you're right. What's interesting, in today's world, we're connected and communications seem to go around the planet within seconds. That didn't occur back then. There were just two Navy F-18s that had a crash out at Mountain Home Air Force Base last week during an air show, and we knew about that almost instantly. Back in the day of the 10th that I'm writing about, that didn't happen, and so a lot of that was shielded from the general public's knowledge. They just weren't aware that it was that kind of danger. But yeah, there were 5 mid-airs during my time at Hahn. Tom Popeye Doyle was killed. Sonny Sundstrom was killed. Mikey Crandall was killed. There was a German glider pilot, civilian glider pilot, that was killed because of a midair in the 10th. Yeah, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's an inherently dangerous business.
It is indeed. It is indeed. There is literally loads more in the book. We've just dropped in and out of various sections of the book.
Ian, you've been very generous with your time and your engagement, and I appreciate that. And I don't want to belabor the point. I guess what I would add is the reason I wrote this book is because the stories are fading and we're getting older. And I think that these stories need to be told. Wagering the Cold War and ultimately being part of it as it ended is something pretty special. And the men and women that I had an opportunity to serve with are the very best people that I've ever met. And I really wanted their stories to be told before they fade away. And so I would just encourage your listeners, if you're interested in reading about ordinary people who did extraordinary things when duty called, pick up the Fightin Tenth and read the story of those sabers.
Absolutely. There will be links in the episode information. You've been listening to Michael Makatura, The book is called The Fightin Tenth, Cold War to Desert Storm. It's a fascinating read. I learnt a lot from it because it's almost like behind the scenes at a fighter squadron. There will be links in the episode information so you can buy the book and help support the podcast. Want to learn more about this episode? Don't miss the extras such as curated videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the episode information. Special thanks to the generous efforts of our financial supporters who keep the show on the air. If you'd like to join this select band, go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations on Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and see you next week.